Welcome, listeners. Step inside, lock your doors, and settle into the quiet. There's a specific kind of vulnerability we accept when we cross the threshold into someone else's home. We assume that the walls will protect us. We assume that the locks will hold. And when we are trusted to protect the most precious things in those homes, the children, we convince ourselves that the idyllic, manicured lawns of the suburbs are a shield against the darker things in this world. But houses are blind spots. Hallways harbor shadows. And sometimes, the most terrifying threats are trying to break in. Sometimes, they are already waiting inside. Fight. We have 3 harrowing accounts of nights where the fragile illusion of safety was completely shattered. 3 stories of babysitters who realized, far too late, that they were not alone. Our first descent into the dark comes from a narrator who is 29 years old today. But the memories of a crisp, early fall evening from 14 years ago remain permanently etched into his psyche. He was 15 years old. Mike. This was meant to be his very first legitimate babysitting gig. Not just watching a toddler relative for an hour, but a genuine, paid responsibility. The clients were family friends, Mark and Diane. These were the kind of people his parents knew well, existing in that suburban social circle where safety is simply assumed by default. They lived in an immaculate, spacious house nestled deep within a quiet, affluent neighborhood. Looking back, the sheer normalcy of the environment is what made the psychological impact so devastating. It was a house that radiated security. It felt just like the home our narrator had grown up in night. His parents dropped him off in the driveway around 6:30 in the evening. Mark and Diane were already dressed for a formal night out. Mark, exhibiting the firm, authoritative demeanor of a businessman, shook the 15-year-old's hand as if concluding a corporate merger. Diane was practically buzzing with gratitude, repeatedly calling him a lifesaver. They quickly ran through the standard operational procedures of child care. The menu, the bedtime routine, the absolute necessity of keeping 5-year-old Charlie's bedroom door slightly ajar. Charlie, they explained, was prone to nocturnal anxieties. The dark hallway frightened him, and he might need an escort to the bathroom in the middle of the night. Mike. Then, Mark shifted the focus to the home's security. He gestured toward the front door, dismissing it entirely. They exclusively used the garage entrance, so the front remained perpetually sealed. The back door, however, leading out onto the rear deck, required specific attention. Mark was adamant about the locking mechanism. He physically pointed out the 2 distinct locks. There was the heavy, reinforced deadbolt at the top, and the standard push but unlock on the doorknob directly beneath it. Mark looked the teenager in the eye and stressed the importance of engaging both mechanisms. Our narrator nodded casually, suppressing a teenage eye roll. He assumed it was common sense. A lock is a lock, right? By 7 o'clock, the taillights of Mark and Diane's car faded down the street, leaving the teenager alone with the 5-year-old. Immediately, Charlie proposed a game of hide-and-seek. Our narrator, armed with a sudden sense of responsibility and intimidated by the sprawling layout of the unfamiliar house, quickly vetoed the idea. The last thing he needed was a lost or injured child squeezed into some obscure cabinet. They compromised. They sat at the coffee table for a simple card-matching game, transitioning smoothly into a low-stakes, cartoonish video game in the family room. As the clock neared 7:45, the babysitter executed the ultimate child care cheat code, macaroni and cheese with a side of chicken nuggets. He even allowed Charlie to eat his dinner bathed in the glow of the television screen, a blatant violation of normal household rules, but a strategic move for a first-time sitter looking to secure an easy shift. Following dinner, the bedtime routine commenced. They ventured up the stairs to the second floor. The architecture of the upper level consisted of a wide, long corridor with several bedrooms branching off, culminating at Charlie's room at the very end. Charlie's sanctuary was typical for a 5-year-old. There was a modest closet with sliding wooden panels, harboring tiny clothes and plastic storage bins on the upper shelves. In the corner of the room, positioned near a heavy wooden dresser, sat a tall, cylindrical laundry hamper equipped with a solid lid. A small nightlight rested on the dresser, casting a weak, amber glow across the carpet. The teenager tucked the boy under the covers, read a brief, obligatory bedtime story, and prepared to exit. Just as he reached the threshold, Charlie's small voice asked him to wait in the hallway for a moment. Our narrator obliged, standing dutifully outside the cracked door. He listened to the sound of blankets rustling for about 30 seconds before the room fell entirely silent. The kid was down. Diane had previously designated the guest bedroom as the babysitter's headquarters for the evening. It was located further down the hall, much closer to the top of the staircase. It was a sterile, perfectly staged room featuring a pristine, untouched comforter and a small television set. Our narrator kicked off his shoes, stretched out on top of the immaculate bed covers, and began mindlessly flipping through cable channels. The heavy lifting of the night was seemingly over. He had successfully fed the child, put him to sleep, and secured his payment. 40 minutes drifted by. The television provided a low, comforting hum. Then a sound cut through the static. Soft, hesitant footsteps padded across the carpeted hallway. Our narrator glanced up toward the open doorway of the guest room. Standing perfectly still in the dim light was little Charlie. He was aggressively rubbing his eyes, a stuffed animal clutched fiercely against his chest. But his expression was entirely wrong. He didn't possess the groggy, confused look of a child waking from a dream. His eyes were wide. His face was a portrait of raw, unadulterated fear. "What?" the teenager asked gently. Charlie refused to cross the threshold into the room. He remained anchored in the hallway, his voice dropping to a terrified, barely audible whisper. "Chris." Our narrator motioned for the boy to come closer. Charlie shuffled forward with agonizing slowness, his body angled awkwardly so he wouldn't have to turn his back to the dark corridor behind him. When he finally reached the bed, Charlie whispered that he had heard something moving inside his closet. The teenager immediately deployed the standard, comforting logic adults use to dismiss the fears of children. He explained the concept of a house settling, how wooden floorboards contract and groan in the cool autumn air. Charlie shook his head frantically. The panic in his eyes deepened. No, the boy insisted before that night. It was a scratch. Despite the chill that ghosted down his spine, Chris remained tethered to rationality. It was a 5-year-old's hyperactive imagination. "Mike," he offered to prove it. He took the boy by the hand, and together, they marched back down the long, shadowed hallway. Chris flipped the main overhead light switch, flooding the bedroom with harsh illumination. He marched directly to the closet. The sliding wooden doors were perfectly shut. He grabbed the edge of one panel and smoothly rolled it to the side. He performed a perfunctory, theatrical sweep. He pushed a few hanging shirts aside, glanced at the storage bins, and confidently declared the space utterly devoid of monsters. He slid the wooden panel firmly shut, ensuring it was flush against the frame. The tension visibly drained from Charlie's tiny shoulders. Chris tucked the boy back into bed, offered a final reassuring smile, and retreated to the glow of the guest room television. 15 minutes passed in absolute silence. Then the rapid, frantic slap of bare feet hitting the hallway carpet. Charlie materialized in the guest room doorway, his chest heaving, his voice trembling on the edge of a sob. "Chris." The closet door moved. A flicker of genuine adolescent annoyance sparked in the teenager's chest, quickly smothered by a forced, patient sigh. "Okay. Let's go look again," he muttered, swinging his legs off the bed. They walked back down the hall. But this time, when Chris reached the doorway of the child's bedroom, his forward momentum completely died. His stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. The closet door was wide open. One of the heavy sliding panels had been shoved entirely to the opposite side of the track, exposing the dark interior. Chris stood paralyzed in the doorway. His brain frantically scrambled to rewrite history. Had he actually closed it? Yes. He distinctly remembered the solid thud of the wood hitting the frame. He looked down at the terrified 5-year-old. "White, why did you open that?" Chris demanded, his tone sharper than intended, tinged with a desperate hope that the kid was playing a prank. But Charlie's denial was absolute. The sheer terror radiating from the boy was impossible to fake. Chris stepped into the room, his heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He grabbed the edge of the sliding door and forcefully pulled it shut. The heavy, weighted glide of the panel confirmed his worst fear. This door was physically incapable of drifting open on a draft. It required deliberate human force. He gave Charlie a stern look, still desperately clinging to the narrative that this was an elaborate, attention-seeking game. He ordered the boy to go to sleep, turned his back, and marched out of the room. But as Chris walked back down the long corridor toward the guest room, the darkness felt heavier. The silence was suffocating. Every instinct in his primal brain was screaming that there was someone walking directly behind him. He forced himself not to run. He forced himself not to look over his shoulder. He sat back down on the guest bed, aggressively reminding himself that he was in a locked, secure fortress in the suburbs. 10 excruciating minutes ticked by. Light. Then, a sound that shattered the silence completely. It wasn't footsteps. It was Charlie's voice. But he wasn't screaming. He was using a shaky, elevated, desperate tone. The sound of a child trying to remain quiet while begging for salvation. Chris bolted off the bed and practically ran down the hallway. He burst into the bedroom. Charlie was sitting bolt upright in his bed, tears streaming silently down his pale cheeks. Chris's eyes immediately locked onto the closet. The door was closed. A wave of confusing relief washed over him, but it evaporated the second he looked back at the boy. "Hey buddy, what happened?" Chris asked, his voice trembling. Charlie didn't speak a single word. He slowly, deliberately lifted his small, shaking arm and pointed a single finger directly toward the corner of the room. Chris followed the trajectory of the boy's trembling hand. In the corner sat the tall, cylindrical laundry hamper. And crushed into the impossibly narrow shadow between the back of that hamper and the drywall was a fully grown human being. They were contorted, crouched low to the ground, desperately compressing their body mass to remain hidden. Time seemed to fracture into agonizing, slow-motion fragments. Chris's brain struggled to process the horrific geometry of the scene. First, he registered the curve of a shoulder wrapped in dark fabric. Light. Then, the rubber sole of a shoe planted on the carpet. And finally, the face. The intruder's face was partially obscured by the woven material of the hamper, but the eyes were visible. And those eyes were locked dead onto the 15-year-old babysitter. For 2 agonizing seconds, no one breathed. The intruder remained frozen, adopting the terrifying logic of a predator. If I don't move, they won't see me. Chris didn't scream. He didn't ask a question. Pure, unfiltered adrenaline hijacked his nervous system. He lunged across the mattress, grabbed the 5-year-old by the torso with both arms, and violently ripped him out of the bed. He hoisted the child into his arms as if the boy were weightless. Never once breaking eye contact with the terrifying figure crouching in the shadows, Chris aggressively backed out of the room. The second they crossed the threshold, Chris turned and sprinted. He flew down the hallway, threw himself and the child into the guest bedroom, slammed the heavy wooden door shut, and violently twisted the lock. He collapsed onto the floor, clutching the terrified child against his chest, frantically digging his cell phone out of his pocket. His hands shook so violently, he could barely dial the 3 digits. Like, when the 911 dispatcher answered, Chris' voice was a frantic, breathless whisper. He gave the address. He explained he was a babysitter. He explicitly stated there was a grown man hiding in the child's bedroom. Does the intruder have a weapon? The operator asked, her voice a beacon of terrifying calm. I don't know, Chris gasped. Are you in a secure location? We are locked in a bedroom on the second floor. The operator ordered him to stay on the line and remain absolutely silent. For the next several minutes, Chris sat paralyzed on the carpet, his eyes glued to the brass doorknob above the guest room. Every second stretched into an eternity. He waited for the knob to slowly turn. He waited for the wood to splinter under the weight of a shoulder. The operator continued to whisper, asking for a physical description, but Chris's mind was blank. All he could see in his mind's eye were those empty, terrifying eyes staring at him from behind the hamper. Finally, the distant, wailing shriek of approaching sirens cut through the night air. It was the most beautiful sound Chris had ever heard. The operator instructed him to remain barricaded until a verified officer knocked on his specific door. Minutes later, heavy boots thundered up the wooden staircase. A sharp, authoritative knock rattled the frame. Chris, it's the police. Open the door. Chris scrambled up, disengaged the lock, and pulled the door open. Two massive police officers stood in the hallway, the brilliant beams of their heavy flashlights cutting through the gloom. They quickly assessed the teenager and the child. The officers revealed a chilling detail they hadn't needed to breach the house. The heavy front door, the door mark explicitly stated they never used, was standing wide open to the night air. The police executed a massive, methodical sweep of every closet, cabinet, and crawl space. The house was empty. Based on the spatial timeline, the detectives concluded that the absolute second Chris grabbed the child and sprinted for the guest room. The intruder uncoiled from his hiding spot, bolted silently down the stairs, and fled out the front entrance into the neighborhood. When Mark and Diane finally arrived, their driveway was a chaotic sea of flashing red and blue lights. The living room was swarming with uniformed officers. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with shock, tears, and frantic questioning. The police interrogated Mark about the entry points and the security hardware. Instantly, Mark marched toward the back door, the one leading to the deck. Chris followed close behind, his stomach tied in knots. Mark grabbed the hardware. The bottom doorknob block was engaged. The heavy deadbolt at the top, the primary line of defense, was completely unlocked. Mark turned slowly, his eyes locking onto the 15-year-old. Did you lock both locks, exactly like I told you to? I locked the bottom one, Chris stammered, his voice cracking. I thought a lock was a lock. What? Mark's face went pale. He didn't scream, but the quiet gravity of his words was devastating. The bottom lock pops open if someone outside jiggles the handle hard enough. That is exactly why I pointed to the deadbolt. Mark couldn't remain angry. The overwhelming reality that Chris had physically pulled his son away from a predator eclipsed any frustration over a misunderstood instruction. But as Chris, now 29, lies awake at night, the what-ifs continue to torture him. What if Charlie had tried to be brave and hadn't come down the hallway? What if Chris had been wearing headphones, ignoring the world? What if he had simply yelled at the boy to go back to sleep without checking the room? The lesson is written in absolute terror when a child tells you there is a monster in their closet. You better believe them. Take a breath, listeners. Let the adrenaline recede. Because our next story shifts the dynamic of fear entirely. What happens when the threat doesn't break in from the outside? What happens when the danger is the very child you were hired to protect? Our narrator was 17 years old, a senior in high school, navigating the lucrative but unpredictable world of neighborhood babysitting. She had been hired for a third time to watch a boy named AJ. AJ was 8 years old, but he lacked the chaotic, joyous energy typical of his age. He was profoundly quiet. He avoided eye contact like it caused him physical pain. During their very first meeting, AJ's mother had pulled the teenager aside and offered a strange disclaimer. She described her son as a strict loner who preferred absolute isolation. She framed this antisocial behavior as a positive trait, assuring the babysitter that the job would be incredibly easy because the boy would simply ignore her. And for the first 2 gigs, that assessment was entirely accurate. The job required zero actual caretaking. The teenager simply heated up prepackaged food and yelled up the stairs when the clock struck bedtime. AJ would spend his entire evening barricaded in his bedroom, sitting inches from his television, playing hyper-violent video games like Grand Theft Auto for hours on end. But the third booking was different. AJ's mother called, her voice tight with stress and desperation. She had an unavoidable, overnight work trip. She needed the 17-year-old to stay the entire night, promising she wouldn't return until late the following morning. White, lured by the prospect of an easy paycheck for simply sleeping in a different bed, the teenager agreed. When she arrived at the house late that afternoon, the atmosphere was frantic. The mother was rushing around the kitchen island, firing off rapid instructions. Frozen pizza was in the freezer. AJ could pour his own cereal in the morning. The babysitter was to sleep in the designated guest room at the far end of the second-floor hallway. She thanked the teenager profusely, almost too profusely, grabbed her bags, and bolted out the door. Left alone in the sudden quiet, the teenager walked to the bottom of the staircase and called out, announcing her presence. From the unseen depths of the upper floor, a short, dull, emotional grunt echoed down. Yeah. For the next several hours, AJ was a ghost. The only evidence of his existence was the muffled, digital cacophony bleeding through the ceiling, the relentless sound of automatic gunfire, screeching tires, and violent collisions from his video game. Eventually, the isolation felt too strange. The babysitter climbed the stairs and pushed open AJ's bedroom door. The 8-year-old was planted on the carpet, his hands gripping the controller with white-knuckled intensity. His unblinking eyes were violently locked onto the flashing screen. When she asked if he needed anything, he didn't even turn his head. He merely offered a subtle, robotic nod. Defeated, she retreated to the living room downstairs, struggling to shake the deeply unsettling feeling of being an unwelcome intruder in a stranger's home. Around 7 o'clock, she pulled the pizza from the oven and called up the stairs. AJ descended like a shadow. He walked into the kitchen, his eyes fixed on the floor. He didn't offer a greeting. He didn't acknowledge her existence. He simply reached out, grabbed a hot slices of pizza with his bare hands, and finally looked up. The expression on the 8-year-old's face sent a sudden, inexplicable chill down the teenager's spine. It was a look of profound, seething resentment. It wasn't the petulant glare of a child told to do their homework. It was a dark, calculating look that seemed to communicate absolute disgust, that she was breathing the same air as him. Without uttering a single syllable, he turned and vanished back up the stairs. She stood frozen in the kitchen, her own plate growing cold, rationalizing the bizarre encounter. That's just a weird, socially awkward kid. Don't take it personally. Later that night, the house settled into an eerie silence. The teenager ascended the stairs to prepare for bed. The guest room was a small, claustrophobic box. Feeling a deep, instinctual need for a spatial escape route, she deliberately left the bedroom door pushed halfway open, casting a narrow beam of light out into the dark hallway. She sat cross-legged on the mattress, her phone pressed to her ear, chatting quietly with a friend named Bree to break the oppressive silence of the house. Mid-sentence, a heavy, primal sensation washed over her, the unmistakable biological warning that she was being observed. She slowly raised her eyes from her lap and looked toward the cracked doorway. Just beyond the wooden frame, suspended in the shadows of the hallway, was AJ's face. He was standing perfectly still, silently staring at her through the gap. The absolute second she made eye contact, his head slowly, mechanically pulled back into the darkness, sliding out of view. A nervous, breathy laugh escaped her lips. It was startling, but she quickly applied logic. Kids are nosy. Kids are weird. What are you doing out there, AJ? She called out, a smile forced into her voice. No response, just the soft, rhythmic patter of bare feet retreating down the hallway toward his bedroom. She shook her head, said goodnight to her friend, and around 11 o'clock, she reached over and clicked off the bedside lamp. The room plunged into absolute blackness. She rolled onto her side, pulled the blankets up to her chin, and closed her eyes. She drifted into the shallow, uneasy sleep of a person in a strange environment. She has no idea how many hours ticked by hell, but suddenly, her eyes snapped open. The room was pitch black, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The air felt heavy, light. The deep, instinctual alarm bells in her nervous system were screaming that she was no longer alone. She blinked, her eyes struggling to adjust to the dark. Standing dead center at the foot of her bed was a towering, black silhouette. Her brain short-circuited. For 3 agonizing seconds, she simply stared at the void, trying to convince herself it was a coat rack, or a shadow cast by the window. But the shadow was breathing. Terrified scream ripped its way out of her throat. She scrambled violently backward against the headboard, her hand frantically slapping the nightstand until her fingers found the lamp switch. Click. The room flooded with light. Standing at the foot of her bed was 8-year-old AJ. He wasn't moving. He wasn't crying. He was standing with terrifying, rigid posture, but the look on his face was a portrait of pure, conflicting psychological horror. He looked deeply annoyed that the light had been turned on, yet beneath the annoyance was a chilling shadow of regret, the look of someone fully aware of the horrific finality of what they are about to do. Both of his arms were pulled rigidly behind his back. What are you doing in here? She demanded, her voice shaking violently. AJ didn't blink. He just stared. Show me what is behind your back. Might. AJ slowly shook his head side to side to side to side. Nope. He never broke eye contact. The sheer, calculated defiance from an 8-year-old in the dead of night was infinitely more terrifying than a tantrum. Adrenaline overrode her paralysis. She threw the blankets aside, swung her legs out of bed, and marched aggressively toward the foot of the mattress, intent on physically marching him back to his room. She reached out and firmly grabbed his small shoulder, forcefully twisting his torso to the side to expose his hidden hands. The breath vanished from her lungs. Clutched tightly in the child's small fist was the heavy, black handle of a massive kitchen knife. Its long, silver blade gleamed under the lamplight. A second, infinitely more desperate scream tore from her mouth. She slapped both hands over her face, stumbling backward in absolute shock. Get out, she shrieked, her entire body convulsing with tremors. Get out of here right now. The child didn't argue. He didn't lunge. He simply turned on his heel and sprinted out into the dark hallway, the massive blade still clutched in his hand. The teenager practically flew across the carpet. She slammed the heavy wooden door, violently twisted the lock, and backed away as if the woodwork oded in poison. She collapsed onto the mattress, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her phone twice before finally dialing his mother's numbers. The line rang in the dark. When the mother finally answered, groggy and confused, the teenager could barely articulate the nightmare. AJ came into my room, she sobbed, struggling to pull oxygen into her lungs. He was standing over me while I was sleeping. He had a massive knife. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. And then, the mother finally spoke. But it wasn't the frantic, disbelieving denial of a parent. Her voice dropped into a hollow, horrified tone of resignation. She sounded like a woman whose deepest, darkest fear had just been confirmed. She didn't question the story. She didn't ask if the teenager was exaggerating. She simply began to apologize. Over and over and over again. "I am so sorry," the mother wept. "I believe you. I am so sorry." "I cannot stay in this house," the teenager cried. "I don't care about the money. I am leaving." The mother didn't beg her to stay. She immediately stated she was calling her ex-husband, who lived nearby, to come retrieve the boy. For the next hour, the 17-year-old sat barricaded in the guest room, her eyes locked on the door handle, waiting for the sound of steel sliding under the doorframe. Finally, a heavy, authoritative knock echoed from the front door downstairs, followed by a man's booming voice calling AJ's name. The teenager cracked hard, or a man she recognized from framed photographs in the living room was marching down the hallway. He didn't look at her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He walked straight toward AJ's bedroom with grim determination. She grabbed her backpack, slipped through the door, and sprinted down the hallway. She kept her eyes glued to the staircase, refusing to even glance into the child's open doorway. She burst out the front door and ran into the safety of the night. The payment arrived via a Venmo hours later, attached to a massive block of apologetic text. But no amount of money could erase the image of that dead-eyed stare. She never babysat again. Because she knows, with absolute, chilling certainty, that she was mere seconds away from becoming a horrific, tragic headline. For our final story, we remain in the sprawling, familiar territory of the suburbs. What? But this time, the babysitter isn't a hired stranger. It's family. Our narrator was a 21-year-old college student we will call Anne. He was the classic fun uncle, frequently enlisted by his older sister to watch his niece, 6-year-old Emma, and his nephew, 9-year-old Lucas. The kids lived in a sprawling, beautiful, two-story house located in a quiet subdivision, just a few miles from where Dan and his sister had grown up. The dynamic was easy, familiar, and entirely devoid of stress. On this particular weekend, Dan's sister and her husband were attending a wedding a few hours away, meaning Uncle Dan was tasked with an overnight stay. Before the parents backed out of the driveway, his sister ran through the standard checklist. Leftover Chinese takeout was in the fridge. No terrifying movies before bed. Lights out at 9 o'clock sharp. She offered one final, specific warning. Emma was prone to nighttime anxiety. She might wake up nervous and call out for her uncle once or twice before truly settling down. The evening went perfectly according to script. They demolished the takeout, laughed through an animated movie in the living room, and as the clock struck 9, Dan herded them up the long wooden staircase. To understand the terror of what follows, you must picture the architecture of the house. The top of the stairs opened onto a long, open balcony that overlooked the expansive living room below. Branching off a small foyer at the end of this balcony were the children's bedrooms, positioned directly across the hall from one another. Dan tucked Emma in first. As predicted, she requested that her bedroom door remain cracked and the hallway light be left blazing. Across the hall, Lucas was an easy out. The 9-year-old simply rolled over, muttered a sleepy goodnight, and buried his face in his pillow. Dan descended the stairs, feeling the sweet satisfaction of a job well done. He collapsed onto the living room couch, grabbed the remote, and flicked on the television, keeping the volume at a barely audible whisper, so as not to disturb the silence above. 30 minutes melted away. Then, the unmistakable sound of small, bare feet padding across the hardwood floor upstairs. Dan sighed, remembering his sister's warning about Emma's anxiety He pushed himself off the couch and began rushing up the stairs. Halfway up, he stopped. Standing at the top of the landing, clutching the wooden railing of the balcony, was 6-year-old Emma. She was swimming in her oversized pajamas, staring down at him with wide, confused eyes. "Wait, what's up, kiddo?" Dan asked softly. "Can't sleep." Emma frowned, tilting her head. "You already came in my room and told me to go back to sleep. But I can't." Dan chuckled, pausing on the steps. "I haven't been upstairs since I tucked you in half an hour ago." Emma didn't smile. Her expression hardened with the absolute certainty of a child recounting a fact. "Yes, you did, Uncle Dan. You stood right in my doorway a few minutes ago. You whispered that everything was fine and to go to sleep." A microscopic prickle of unease touched the back of Dan's neck. But logic quickly prevailed. Kids have incredibly vivid dreams. She just woke up from a half-sleep state in blurred reality. He maintained his gentle smile, climbed the remaining stairs, and gently guided the little girl back to her room. To humor her, he performed a theatrical sweep of the closet and checked under the bed. He tucked the blankets tightly around her shoulders. She finally laid her head down, but as Dan backed out of the room, her eyes never left his face. She was scrutinizing him. Like she wasn't entirely convinced he was the same person who had been there minutes before. Dan walked back down the stairs, pouring himself a glass of water, aggressively brushing off the lingering chill in the air. 20 minutes later, the silence of the house was broken again. Heavy, dragging footsteps on the upper landing. Dan looked up. Standing on the balcony, aggressively rubbing sleep from his eyes, was 9-year-old Lucas. Lucas stared down at the living room, his brow furrowed in genuine irritation. "White, why did you come into my room?" he whined. The glass of water in Dan's hand suddenly felt freezing cold. "I didn't, buddy," Dan replied, his voice losing its playful edge. Lucas shook his head. "Yes, you did. He stood right next to my dresser. You just stared at me in the dark for a minute, and then you walked out without saying anything. It was weird." The psychological floor completely dropped out from under the 21-year-old. One child having a vivid dream is a normal, everyday occurrence. 2 children, sleeping in separate rooms, describing the exact same physical intrusion within 30 minutes of each other. That is a pattern, and it was a terrifying one. Dan didn't argue. He didn't tell Lucas to go back to bed. He gestured for the boy to come downstairs and sit next to him on the couch. Dan grabbed the TV remote and pressed the power button. The screen went black. The sudden silence in the house was absolute. It was so heavy, so profound, that it caused a physical ringing in Dan's ears. He sat perfectly still, his eyes darting toward the vaulted ceiling, desperately listening to the acoustics of the sprawling house. Lucas, sensing the sudden, terrifying shift in his uncle's demeanor, began to panic. "Uncle Dan, what's wrong?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Dan raised a single finger to his lips. And then, they both heard it. From the second floor, directly above their heads. Thump, thump, light, rapid footsteps. But it wasn't the heavy, lumbering gait of an adult. It was the frantic, terrified sprinting of a child. Suddenly, Emma's tiny form exploded into view on the balcony overhead. She was running for her life. She tore across the landing, practically throwing herself down the wooden staircase, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Uncle Dan! Uncle Dan! Uncle Dan!" She hit the living room floor and collided with Dan's legs, weeping with a chaotic, unhinged terror. "Emma, what is it?" White, Dan demanded, his own heart threatening to hammer its way out of his ribcage. Emma buried her face in his shirt, her small body convulsing with sobs. "There is someone upstairs. Someone came into my room again. He said goodnight. Like, but it didn't sound like you." Every single alarm bell in Dan's biological survival system began shrieking simultaneously. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't a shadow playing tricks on a wall. There was a living, breathing intruder inside this house, and they were actively stalking the children. Dan forced his voice to remain steady. He looked at Lucas, whose eyes were wide with rising panic. "Listen to me," Dan ordered, his tone brokering no argument. "You and Emma stay exactly right here on this couch. Do not move a stick before that May. I am going upstairs to check." He turned on his heel and marched straight into the kitchen. He opened the heavy wooden block on the counter, wrapped his fingers around the handle of an 8-inch chef's knife, and pulled it free. Holding the blade tight against his thigh to conceal it from the children, he walked back into the living room. He approached the bottom of the staircase. He took a deep breath and began the climb. As he reached the top landing, he tried to project an aura of calm for the terrified kids watching from below. He even performed an exaggerated, goofy marching step as he crossed the balcony, attempting a desperate smile to diffuse their panic. It failed completely. The kids just stared at him, paralyzed. Dan crossed the open balcony and stepped into the small, shadowed foyer that connected the children's bedrooms. He crept toward Emma's open doorway. The hallway light spilled into the room, illuminating the empty bed. Dan peered around the doorframe. The room appeared empty. Hoping against hope that the house was clear, he let out a soft, questioning whisper, hoping not to carry his voice down to the living room. "Hello." What happened next will haunt Dan until the day he dies. He didn't expect a response, but from the deepest, darkest corner of the bedroom, a voice spoke back. It was a man's voice. But it was entirely wrong. The pitch was bizarrely high, strained, and sing-song, carrying a grotesque, theatrical cadence that sent absolute ice water through Dan's veins. It sounded like the voice of a man whose mind was completely shattered. "Aren't they just so special?" The voice cooed in the dark. As Dan's eyes adjusted to the shadows in the corner, a massive silhouette detached itself from the wall next to Emma's empty bed. It was a man, but his proportions were terrifying. He towered over the furniture, standing at an imposing 6 feet, 4 inches tall. He was a hulking, physical giant, standing dead still in the dark of a 6-year-old's bedroom. The knife in Dan's hand suddenly felt like a useless toy. Panic and pure survival instinct completely overrode his bravado. Dan spun on his heel, bolted out of the foyer, and sprinted down the staircase like a man on fire. He hit the living room floor and screamed at the children. "Get your shoes on. Now." "Wake." Emma's crying escalated into a hysterical shriek. Dan spun around to see what she was looking at. He looked up toward the second-floor balcony. Leaning over the wooden railing, staring down into the brightly lit living room, was the intruder. His face was a grotesque, twisted mask of madness. He wasn't running. He wasn't charging down the stairs to attack. Instead, the towering, terrifying man raised his massive hands, covered his face, and then spread his fingers wide, playfully mocking the screaming children. He was playing PKOO. "Forget the shoes," Dan roared. He grabbed Emma under one arm, snagged Lucas by the shirt collar, and threw his weight against the front door. The three of them exploded out into the freezing night air, wearing nothing but their socks. They didn't stop to look back. Dan dragged the weeping children down the dark street, sprinting toward a house 3 doors down where a porch light blazed like a beacon. He threw himself against the neighbor's front door, pounding his fist against the wood and aggressively ringing the doorbell over and over and over. A confused older woman opened the door. Dan recognized her as a casual acquaintance of his sister's. "There's a man in their house," Dan screamed, shoving the children inside. Lock the door." The woman didn't hesitate. She pulled them into the foyer and threw the deadbolt. Then immediately dialed 911, pushing his way back out onto the neighbor's front porch, refusing to take his eyes off his sister's house down the street. As the emergency dispatcher answered, asking for the address, Dan watched the nightmare unfold in surreal slow motion. The heavy front door of his sister's house slowly swung open. The towering, 6 foot for intruders stepped out onto the porch. He didn't run. He didn't look frantic. He simply shoved his hands deep into his pockets and began a casual, leisurely stroll down the concrete walkway, turning onto the sidewalk and walking away into the dark. "He's leaving," Dan hissed into the phone, his blood boiling with adrenaline and rage. "He's walking away right now. I'm going after him." "Sir, absolutely do not engage," the 911 operator ordered sternly. "Do not follow the suspect. We have multiple units en route. Stay where you are." Dan gripped the railing of the porch, his knuckles white. To this day, the regret burns in his chest. He wishes he had ignored the operator. He wishes he had chased the phantom down and beaten him into the asphalt. But reality is a harsh anchor. The man was a giant, potentially armed, and clearly operating completely outside the bounds of human sanity. Dan stood frozen on the neighbor's stoop, feeding street names and directions to the dispatcher, until the tall, grotesque figure finally turned down an intersecting street and vanished into the shadows. It felt like an eternity before the flashing lights finally saturated the neighborhood. By the time the heavily armed officers breached and cleared the sister's house, the ghost was long gone. Bite. The trail was dead. The man could have slipped into the woods, or simply vanished into the home of another unsuspecting family on the next block. Furious with the response time, and terrified that the man might return, Dan loaded his niece and nephew into his car and drove them miles away to his parents' house. They would not spend another second in that house. In the agonizing aftermath, fingers were pointed. How could this happen on the one night the uncle was in charge? But Dan remained steadfast in his horrifying conclusion. He didn't unlock any exterior doors. He didn't open any windows. The only logical, terrifying explanation is that the massive, deranged man was already inside the house when Anne and the children arrived. He had been waiting in the dark, listening to them eat dinner, watching them watch a movie, biding his time until the children were alone in the dark. Today, Dan's sister and her husband live in a veritable fortress. They installed over a half-dozen high-definition security cameras covering every square inch of the interior and exterior of the property. Paranoia dictates their every move. But can you really blame them? When you realize that the monsters are just in the closet. But that they lean over the balcony to smile at you. The dark never really looks the same again. Thank you for joining us in the dark tonight. Check your locks, check your closets, and whatever you do. Don't ignore the scratch in the dark. Good night. Welcome, listeners. Turn down the lights, lock your doors, and settle into the quiet. There is a distinct, heavy isolation that belongs exclusively to the dead of night. It's a time when the rules of the waking world seem to fray at the edges, when the boundaries between safety and absolute terror become dangerously thin. We like to believe that the glow of artificial light, the hum of a street lamp, the neon sign of a storefront, offers us protection. We convince ourselves that as long as we stay in the light, the darkness cannot reach us. But tonight's stories prove that the light doesn't repel the nightmares. Sometimes, it merely illuminates them. Our guide into the dark tonight is a man named David. He has brought us to distinct experiences from his life. 2 chilling encounters that serve as a brutal reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural phantoms. They are flesh, bone, and deeply, violently unpredictable. Our first descent takes us back several years. It takes us to the middle of nowhere. David was working the graveyard shift at a remote, utterly isolated gas station and convenience store. It was an era just before the total saturation of modern technology. Today, every inch of retail space is monitored by high-definition, state-of-the-art security cameras, uploading directly to the cloud. But back then, surveillance was an afterthought. It wasn't that cameras didn't exist. It was simply that the owner of this particular establishment was notoriously, painfully cheap. The owner was, in David's own words, a man possessing the cognitive retention of a goldfish. Working for him was an exercise in pure, cyclical frustration. Like, they would engage in the exact same arguments multiple times a week. The owner would constantly loop back to long-resolved issues, completely forgetting that they had already been addressed. But despite the maddening management, David stayed. He stayed because the job itself was laughably, almost numbingly easy. The shift ran from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. For 8 agonizingly slow hours, David was the sole custodian of this glowing island in a sea of rural darkness. Traffic was practically non-existent. Most nights, his only company was the crushing weight of his own boredom. It was a weeknight. The exact hour has been swallowed by the specific amnesia that retail workers develop when the ungodly hours of the morning blend into one massive, endless lump of misery. David was assuming his usual position, leaning heavily against the laminate counter, a glossy magazine spread open in his hands, desperately trying to anchor his mind to the colorful pages so he wouldn't slip into unconsciousness. Light. The store was dead silent. If you have ever spent time in a sterile, commercial space late at night, you know the sound. The faint, high-pitched, electric buzz of aging fluorescent lights. For hours, it was the only auditory stimulation in the room. David's brain had completely tuned it out, turning the hum into a layer of invisible white noise. Which is why the sudden, sharp chime of the front door opening hit his nervous system like a physical shock. David's head snapped up. A man was walking through the double-glass doors. He was tall, somewhere in his 30s, an African-American man possessing an imposing, above-average, athletic build. David's initial, split-second assessment was that this guy looked like a former professional athlete. But then, David's eyes adjusted before that night. His brain tried to process the visual information being fed to it, and the cognitive gears ground to a horrifying, screeching halt. The man was covered in blood. And this was not a minor injury. It wasn't a bloody nose or a scraped knuckle. It was a cartoonish, incomprehensible volume of blood. It saturated his clothing. A massive, horrific splatter painted the entire front of his chest. Thick, dark crimson streaks were smeared violently across his face and his muscular arms. For a fraction of a second, David's mind desperately searched for a rational explanation. It's paint. It has to be repaint. But the primal, reptilian part of the human brain knows the texture, the sheen, and the heavy reality of blood when it sees it. It was everywhere. The human mind is a fragile instrument. When confronted with a sight so jarringly outside the parameters of normal, lived experience, it simply paralyzes. David stood frozen behind the register, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to breathe. But the blood wasn't the most terrifying part. It was the man's eyes. They were completely, utterly empty. There was no pain, no shock, no adrenaline, no fear. There was absolutely nothing behind them. It was a void. He strolled into the convenience store at 2 in the morning with the relaxed, almost bored posture of a man stepping out to buy a pack of gum on a Sunday afternoon. He moved with a casual fluidity, acting as though he were completely oblivious to the fact that he was drenched in the evidence of a massacre. David was trapped in a nightmare. His feet cemented to the linoleum floor. He knew he shouldn't stare. He knew that making eye contact with a predator is the fastest way to become prey, but he couldn't help it. Every time he managed to tear his gaze away, his eyes violently snapped right back to the empty, dead stare of the man covered in blood. Naturally, the man noticed it. He stopped in the middle of the aisle. He slowly turned his head, locking his hollow eyes directly onto David's terrified face. David's heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against his ribs. What? What was the man going to do? Yell, attack, flee. Instead, the corners of the man's mouth slowly curled upward into a chilling, empty smile. Don't worry, the man said, his voice terrifyingly calm, smooth as glass. It's not my blood. The words hung in the sterile, buzzing air of the convenience store. But they were intended to be reassuring, but they had the exact opposite effect. It was a confirmation of David's absolute worst fear. It's not my blood. The emergency alarms in David's mind began to shriek. He is a murderer. He just butchered someone. I am standing in a room with a killer, and I am going to be next. The urge to scream, to run out the back door and flee into the dark fields, was overwhelming. But survival instinct is a strange and powerful force. It overrode David's panic and forced him into a state of robotic compliance. David forced his stiff neck to nod, imitating the casual acknowledgement of a passing comment about the weather. He violently jerked his eyes downward, burying his face back into his magazine, pretending to read words that were nothing but a blurry, meaningless swirl of ink. Through his peripheral vision, David tracked the monster. The man leisurely strolled through the narrow aisles, browsing the snacks and drinks as if the world were perfectly normal. He grabbed a handful of random items and began walking toward the checkout counter. A bizarre thought flashed through David's panicked mind. Just steal it. Please. Just walk out the door. If the man had simply shoplifted the items and vanished, David would have gladly let him go. But he didn't. The man stepped right up to the register, bridging the agonizingly short physical distance between them. David's hands shook as he reached out to scan the items. The barcode scanner beeped, a sharp, piercing noise in the quiet store. David kept his eyes firmly glued to the counter, hyper-focused on the packaging, terrified that if he looked up, he would be pulled back into those empty, dead eyes. The metallic smell of copper hung heavy in the air between them. The transaction felt like an eternity. Finally, the man pulled a wad of cash from his pocket, paid, and without uttering another single syllable, turned and walked away. The glass door slid open. The chime rang out. The man stepped into the dark parking lot, and the doors clicked shut behind him. David collapsed against the counter, exhaling a ragged, shaking breath. He waited, his ears straining against the silence. Somewhere out in the blackness of the parking lot, the heavy rumble of a car engine roared to life. Tires crunched against the asphalt as the vehicle pulled away. The second the sound began to fade, David snatched the heavy plastic receiver of the landline phone and furiously dialed 91111. The dispatcher answered, and David's words spilled out in a frantic, panicked torrent. He described the man. He described the immense, cartoonish volume of blood. He described the casual, psychopathic smile. He told the dispatcher he had no idea what crime had just been committed in the dark, but he was absolutely certain that someone, somewhere, had just been subjected to extreme violence. The dispatcher, maintaining a professional calm, began asking clarifying questions. "Sir, can you tell me the make and model of the vehicle? Which direction did he turn out of the lot?" David was mid-sentence, his mouth open to respond, when the sound echoed through the store again. Chime. David's heart dropped into his stomach. Great, he thought. Another customer. The absolute last thing I need right now. He raised his eyes toward the entrance. It wasn't another customer. It was him. But the man covered in blood was standing in the doorway. He hadn't left. And this time, the calm, relaxed demeanor was entirely gone. The empty eyes had been replaced by a burning, unhinged fury. David realized his fatal mistake. The store was essentially a massive glass fishbowl. The man hadn't driven away. He had pulled his car to the edge of the lot, sat in the dark, and watched David through the illuminated front windows. He had seen David immediately lunge for the telephone. David slammed the receiver down onto the cradle, but the damage was done. The man knew exactly who he was talking to. Like, the stranger stormed across the linoleum, his heavy boots pounding a terrifying rhythm. He reached the counter, slamming his blood-soaked hands onto the laminate surface, and screamed, demanding to know if David had just called the police. No, I swear. David lied, his voice cracking with pure terror. The man wasn't buying it. Not for a single second. The situation violently escalated. The man began spitting curses, roaring at David to mind his own business, screaming that he knew David was a liar. David threw his hands up in the universal gesture of surrender. He backed away from the register, offering no resistance, desperately trying to de-escalate the explosive rage radiating from the killer. He remained silent, praying the man would just yell his piece and leave. But there is no reasoning with madness. The man's voice reached a deafening crescendo. And then, David saw the physical shift, the tensing of the muscles, the dropping of the shoulders. David recognized it just a fraction of a second too late. The man didn't try to climb over the counter. He didn't try to walk around it. Using his massive athletic frame, he lodged himself entirely over the barrier, flying through the air like a predatory animal. Before David could even raise his arms to defend himself, the sheer mass of the man slammed into his chest. They crashed backward, violently hitting the floor behind the register. In a span of 2 seconds, the encounter went from a verbal assault to a fight for absolute survival. The man was straddling David's chest, his massive, blood-slicked hands violently wrapping around David's throat. The pressure was instantaneous and crushing. The air supply was cut off. David was fighting for his life. Prior to this night, he had never been in a physical altercation. He had never thrown a punch in anger. But as the darkness began to creep into the edges of his vision, the primal will to live exploded within him. He knew with absolute certainty that this man was actively trying to murder him on the floor of the convenience store. David thrashed with everything he had. He kicked his legs wildly, his boots slamming against the cabinetry. He scratched at the man's face, tearing at his skin. He bit down, thrashing his head side to side to side to side. As they rolled violently across the dirty linoleum, the horror compounded. Like the thick, wet blood that saturated the man's clothing was smearing everywhere. It soaked into David's shirt. It painted David's face. He was being suffocated while drowning in the warm blood of an unknown victim. His strength was fading. The crushing grip on his windpipe was unyielding. Desperation bred a final, chaotic idea. Gathering the very last ounce of air in his lungs, David screamed through the choking grip. I have a gun. I have a gun and I will blow your head off. It was a complete and total bluff. David didn't own a weapon. There was no gun behind the counter. But whether it was the sheer, feral desperation in David's voice, or the sudden realization that the police might already be on their way, the bluff worked. Click. The man's eyes snapped wide. He instantly released his grip, scrambling backward off David's chest. He didn't look back. He scrambled over the counter, his heavy boots slipping on the linoleum, and bolted through the sliding glass doors, disappearing into the night. David lay on the floor, gasping violently, his throat burning with agony. He stared up at the buzzing fluorescent lights, his vision swimming in a painful haze. He listened as the car engine roared to life once more, the tires squealing as the vehicle tore out of the parking lot and vanished down the dark, rural highway. David didn't move. He lay there in the silence, his chest heaving, his face and clothes plastered with a horrifying mixture of his own sweat and the blood of a stranger. 10 minutes later, the wail of sirens finally pierced the night. 2 police cruisers slid into the parking lot. When the officers rushed behind the counter and found David lying on the floor in that horrific state, the urgency shifted immediately. They didn't even stop to take a formal statement. They took one look at the blood, realized the gravity of the threat, and immediately rushed back out to their cruisers, tearing off down the highway to hunt the man down. David never heard from them again. He scoured the local news for weeks. He checked the papers, watched the broadcasts, looking for any mention of a murder, a bloody suspect, or an arrest in the area. There was absolutely nothing. The silence was deafening. He was left completely in the dark, forced to carry the trauma of the most terrifying, life-threatening physical encounter of his entire existence. If you believe that the nightmare ended when the police arrived, you are sorely mistaken. Because what happened next is an entirely different breed of psychological horror. Several months passed. In a decision that defies logical preservation, David was still working the night shift at the exact same gas station. He needed the paycheck, and human beings possess a remarkable ability to rationalize trauma. He had convinced himself that the blood-soaked man was a glitch in the matrix, a freak occurrence, a violent anomaly that had a statistical 0% chance of ever repeating itself. He was wrong. It was another late night. The circumstances were a mirror image of the first incident. David was utterly alone in the glowing fishbowl of the store, leaning against the counter, dying of a boredom that felt uniquely oppressive. David looked up, his heart immediately skipping a beat. But the man walking through the doors was not the athletic, blood-soaked killer. It was an entirely different stranger. But this man immediately set off every alarm bell in David's newly traumatized nervous system. The first anomaly was the man's attire. He was wearing a suit. And this wasn't a cheap, off-the-rack garment. It was an immaculate, expensive, perfectly tailored dark gray suit that screamed wealth and authority. He had absolutely no business being anywhere near a rundown rural gas station past midnight dressed like that. David's brain desperately tried to write a narrative. HES coming back from a late wedding. HES, a wealthy businessman lost on his way home from a corporate gala. But deep down, David knew the truth. High-powered individuals in bespoke suits do not casually wander into isolated convenience stores in the dead of night. It doesn't happen. The man's behavior only amplified the dread. He didn't browse the snacks. He didn't glance at the coolers. He made no attempt to hide his intentions, or perhaps he was simply too powerful to care. He walked with a smooth, purposeful stride directly up to the checkout counter, stopping mere inches from David. He didn't speak. He didn't even look David in the eye. The suited man slowly reached a hand inside his tailored jacket. David held his breath, bracing for a weapon. Instead, the man's fingers withdrew a glossy photograph. He placed it gently onto the laminate counter, sliding it forward until it rested directly under David's gaze. At first, David was merely confused. But when his eyes focused on the image, the blood turned to ice water in his veins. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. It was a photograph of the man. The tall, athletic killer who had walked into the store drenched in blood. The man who had tackled David to the floor and tried to crush his windpipe. The picture was slightly grainy, perhaps taken from a distance or a low-quality camera, but the facial features were undeniable. It was unmistakably the same person. A cold sweat broke out across David's forehead. He tried desperately to mask his shock, to keep his facial expression entirely neutral, but he knew he was failing. He kept his eyes glued to the photograph, terrified to look up, because he could physically feel the heavy, oppressive weight of the suited man's gaze bearing down on him. But the silence stretched. It became a physical pressure in the room. The suited man didn't say a word. He just waited. Finally, unable to bear the tension, David slowly raised his head to meet the stranger's gaze. The man in the suit was staring at him. Not with anger, but with a cold, piercing intensity, as if he were forensically studying every micro-expression on David's face, attempting to read his very mind. It was a painfully, suffocatingly awkward standoff. David wasn't sure if he was expected to speak, so he kept his mouth firmly shut. After an uncomfortably long, agonizing pause, the suited man finally broke the silence. His voice was a shock. It was incredibly gruff, deep and textured, like gravel grinding against stone. The voice of a man who had smoked a full pack of cigarettes every day of his life. "Have you ever seen this man before?" he asked, his tone flat and devoid of emotion. David didn't hesitate. Survival instinct kicked in with blinding speed. "No," David said instantly. "I haven't." He couldn't fully articulate why he lied in that moment, but every fiber of his being, his absolute deepest gut instinct, was screaming at him, "Deny. Deny. Deny." He knew with terrifying certainty that whoever this suited man was, and whatever illicit, violent underworld he belonged to, David wanted absolutely zero part in it. Acknowledging the photo meant acknowledging involvement. The suited man did not respond. He didn't blink. He just maintained that cold, calculating, impenetrable stare. It was profoundly unnerving. The silence returned, more agonizing than before. With every passing second, the invisible ticking clock in David's head pounded louder, and his confidence in his own lie began to rapidly dissolve. Still, David refused to break. He held his ground, desperately projecting the aura of a clueless, bored gas station attendant. It was an implicit, psychological standoff. Two men, standing in a brightly lit room in the middle of the night, communicating entirely through silence. Finally, the suited man yielded it. He broke eye contact, reached down with a slow, deliberate motion, and picked the photograph up off the counter, slipping it seamlessly back into his tailored jacket. He turned his back. David let out a massive, silent sigh of relief. His chest deflated. "It's over," he thought. He bought it. HES leaving. David watched the man walk with that same smooth, purposeful stride down the aisle toward the glass doors. But right before his hand touched the handle, the suited man stopped dead in his tracks. He didn't turn his body, but he slowly turned his head back over his shoulder, locking eyes with David one final, terrifying time. The gruff voice echoed through the empty store. "I know you're lying." Before David's paralyzed brain could even formulate a response, the man pushed the door open, the chime rang out, and he vanished into the dark. The psychological aftermath of that encounter devastated David. The fragile illusion of safety he had built over the past few months was completely shattered. Standing alone in the brightly lit store no longer felt boring. It felt like standing naked in the crotchets of a sniper rifle. His mind spun in endless, terrifying circles. Who was that guy? How did he know about the first incident? How did he know to come to this exact gas station with that exact photograph? David wondered if the man was an undercover detective, a rogue cop investigating a homicide. But the terrifying logic of the criminal underworld dismantled that theory. If the man had been legitimate law enforcement, he would have flashed a badge. He would have identified himself to compel a witness to speak. The fact that he relied on intimidation, tailored suits, and cryptic threats could only signify one thing. He was something else entirely. He was a cleaner, a fixture, a dangerous man connected to whatever bloody business the first man had been involved in. And that realization terrified David to his very core. He didn't call the police this time. The PTSD from the first brutal attack, combined with the utter lack of follow-up from law enforcement, convinced him that involving the cops would only paint a larger target on his back. What would he even say? The man in a nice suit showed me a picture and called me a liar. For a few agonizing weeks, David lived on a knife's edge, jumping at every shadow, expecting the suited man, or the bloody killer, to walk back through those doors. But the threat didn't return to the gas station. It evolved. It started subtly. A creeping paranoia that slowly crystallized into a horrifying reality. David began noticing a specific vehicle, a pristine silver SUV. At first, he spotted it parked on the dusty shoulder across the highway from the gas station during his daytime shifts. It sat there, idle, windows heavily tinted. A solitary vehicle on a desolate road isn't entirely abnormal, so David tried to brush it off. But then, the perimeter began to shrink. A few days later, David drove into town to run errands. As he was loading bags into his car in the parking lot of his local grocery store, he glanced up. Sitting 3 rows over, engine idling, was the silver SUV. White, that was a touch stranger. A chill spider walked down David's spine, but he forced himself to look away and ducked her home. And then came the final, undeniable confirmation. David looked out the window of his small, isolated rental house, and there it was, the silver SUV, parked on his quiet residential street, sitting silently in the shadows. The alarm bells didn't just ring. They deafened him. David was not a paranoid man by nature, but when a highly specific vehicle tracks your movements from your workplace, to your errands, to your most private sanctuary over the course of 2 weeks, coincidence dies. He knew exactly who was behind the tinted glass. It had to be the man in the tailored suit. The sheer terror of the situation threatened to crush him. How had the man found his address? How had he tracked him down? David lived entirely alone. He didn't own a firearm. He had no roommates to rely on, no guard dog to bark at the door. He was entirely, hopelessly exposed. In a profound display of denial, a psychological defense mechanism when faced with an insurmountable threat, David tried to convince himself that if he just ignored it, the stalker would grow bored and disappear. He told himself he would call the police the next time he saw the car. Always the next time. It was an awful, nearly fatal way to proceed. 3 weeks after the suited man had first walked into the convenience store, the creeping dread culminated in an explosion of violence. It was the dead of night. David was fast asleep in his bedroom. The silence of the house was violently ruptured by the deafening, explosive sound of glass shattering. David was jerked awake, his heart instantly redlining. But this time, unlike the night in the gas station, his reaction wasn't to freeze. It wasn't to flee. The weeks of simmering paranoia and terror ignited into pure, adrenaline-fueled rage. He chose to fight. He rolled out of bed, his hand diving under the mattress, pulling out a heavy, solid wood baseball that he kept hidden there. Barefoot and gripping the weapon with white knuckles, he charged out of his bedroom and into the dark living room, ready to swing at whatever monster had breached his home. He hit the lights, which the room was empty. Because the house was so small, it took him only a few frantic seconds to clear the kitchen and the hallway. He was entirely alone. But the living room window had been completely obliterated. Jagged shards of glass glittered across the carpet like dangerous diamonds. And sitting dead center in the middle of the floor, surrounded by the debris of his shattered security, was an object. It was a rock. Just a plain, heavy, fist-sized stone. David approached it slowly, his bat still raised. There was no piece of paper tied to it. There was no threatening note trapped around it. There didn't need to be. The message was exquisitely, terrifyingly clear. We know exactly where you sleep. We can touch you whenever we want. And walls will not protect you. In that crystal clear moment, staring at the rock on his carpet, David's denial evaporated. He realized he could not play this game anymore. This man was actively stalking him. He was connected to an underworld of immense, casual violence, and he was trying to send a message. David didn't know what the message was, and more importantly, he knew he wanted absolutely no part of finding out. The next morning, as soon as the sun rose, David walked into the gas station and quit. He didn't give 2 weeks' notice. He walked out the door and never looked back. He immediately broke his lease and began frantically searching for a new place to live. It took him a grueling, paranoid month to secure an nondescript, anonymous apartment several towns over. During that agonizing transition period, he never saw the silver SUV again, but his mind was made up. He vanished. He found a new job, kept his head down, and slowly tried to rebuild a sense of peace. Less than a year later, unable to shake the lingering feeling of being watched, he packed his life into boxes and moved entirely out of state, putting thousands of miles between himself and the nightmare. And that was the end of it. But the psychological scars remain. As David sits in his new life, years removed from the events, he constantly dissects the trauma. While the first encounter, being strangled on the floor by a blood-soaked killer, was undeniably more life-threatening in the physical sense, it is the second encounter that truly haunts him. The sheer, calculated malice of the suited man, the meticulous stalking, the intimidation. Why would an organized, dangerous syndicate go through so much trouble to harass a minimum-wage gas station clerk, simply because he dialed 911 on a chaotic murderer? The only logical, terrifying explanation David can muster is that the suited man somehow believed David was an accomplice. That the cartel, or the syndicate, believed David was harboring the bloody man, sheltering him, or aiding his escape. He will never know for sure. The truth of that bloody night remains buried in the dark, a horrifying mystery he was lucky to walk away from. Take a deep breath. Listeners, let the tension in your shoulders drop. Because David's dance with the terrifying unknown did not end in that gas station. The darkness has a way of finding those who have already looked into it. We shift our focus to a much more recent event. This happened a mere 8 months ago. The setting is no longer a static building. It is the desolate, unforgiving expanse of the American highway system. David was driving home. He had been working a grueling, physically demanding job at a remote site located 3 long hours away from his house. The work had run severely over schedule, draining every ounce of energy from his muscles. But by the time he finally threw his tools into the back of his older, beat-up pickup truck and climbed behind the steering wheel, the clock had already ticked past 10 at night. A 3-hour drive might not sound like a Herculean task to a well-rested traveler. But when your body has been battered by manual labor, and your bloodstream is completely depleted of the caffeine required to keep your brain functioning, the simple, biological act of keeping your eyelids open becomes an agonizing war of attrition. Adding to the danger, David's truck was an older model. It possessed none of the modern, computerized luxuries that offer a false sense of security. There was no lane assist, no automatic braking, no gentle chimes warning him he was drifting. It was just man, machine, and the hypnotic, repetitive white lines of the dark highway. 45 minutes into the journey, David hit the wall. His body began to shut down. His eyelids grew incredibly heavy, drifting downward on their own accord, forcing him to physically jerk his head and shake his face to snap himself out of the dangerous micro-sleeps. He knew the harsh truth of the road. If he pushed it, he was going to wrap his truck around a concrete pillar. He needed to stop. Spotting the towering, illuminated sign of a highway rest stop, David pulled off the exit and rolled into the parking lot of a massive, quiet gas station. It was pushing 11 o'clock. He stepped out into the cool night air, filled his tank with fuel, lit a cigarette, and stood by the pumps, debating his next move. The nicotine offered a brief spike of clarity, but the crushing weight of exhaustion immediately suppressed it. He still had over 2 hours of monotonous driving ahead of him. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he wouldn't survive the trip. He made the only sensible decision. He would take a quick nap in the truck, let his brain reset, and finish the drive in the early hours of the morning. David climbed back into the cab, drove the truck to the furthest, darkest corner of the expansive parking lot, far away from the glaring canopy lights, and killed the engine. He locked the doors, leaned his seat back, and closed his eyes. He had slept in far worse places before. It didn't seem like a dangerous vulnerability. It was just a necessary rest. He was unconscious almost instantly. When the piercing alarm on his cell phone finally shattered the silence, David jolted awake. It felt as though he had merely blinked, but a full hour had vanished. He rubbed his face, his mouth tasting like stale coffee and nicotine. He wasn't fully refreshed, far from it, but the dangerous, heavy fog of absolute exhaustion had lifted just enough. He was alert enough to drive. He peered out the windows. The parking lot, which had contained a few other resting vehicles when he arrived, was now completely desolate. He was the only soul in the dark expanse of asphalt. Without a second thought, David turned the ignition, the engine rumbling to life, and steered the truck back onto the desolate on-ramp, merging into the pitch-black void of the midnight highway. For the first 20 minutes, the drive was uneventful. The road was a ghost town. David fell into a state of highway hypnosis, zoning out, allowing deeply ingrained muscle memory to take over the mechanics of steering and accelerating. He was essentially operating on human autopilot, his mind drifting through the quiet dark. And then, the quiet was broken. It started subtly, so subtly that David's exhausted brain took several long minutes to even register the sound as an anomaly. Thump. Light. Thump. Thump. But he reached down and dialed back the fan speed of the air conditioning, reducing the ambient noise in the cab, straining his ears to isolate the sound. It was a faint, irregular thumping noise, and it was coming from somewhere directly behind his head. David checked his rearview mirror, but it offered nothing but darkness. He twisted his torso, peering over his shoulder, into the cramped back seat of the extended cab. He looked for a loose tool, a rolling water bottle, anything that might be bouncing against the plastic trim. The back seat was entirely empty. Logic dictated a simple conclusion. It was just a heavy tool, or a piece of equipment, sliding around in the metal bed of the truck, bumping against the cab wall as the suspension absorbed the imperfections of the highway. Beyond idle speculation, there was nothing to be done. The noise was irritating, but it didn't warrant the danger of pulling over onto the dark, narrow shoulder of the interstate. He made a mental note to secure his gear when he finally reached his driveway, and he pressed his foot down on the accelerator. But the sound didn't fade. It continued. Thump, thump. It became incredibly grating, a persistent, rhythmic annoyance that began to deeply agitate David's already frayed nerves. Desperate for a distraction, he reached over and violently cranked the volume dial on the radio, filling the cab with loud music, attempting to drown out the thumping from the bed. But the vibration was still there. Finally, boiling over with sudden, irrational frustration, David raised his right hand and violently slammed his palm down against the hard plastic of the dashboard, cursing loudly into the empty cab. And then, what? A miracle. The moment his hand struck the dash, the thumping instantly ceased. Silence descended over the truck, save for the hum of the tires on the asphalt. For 10 glorious minutes, the ride was peaceful. David let out a breath of relief. Not because the noise had frightened him, he was still operating under the assumption it was a loose wrench, but because the irritation had finally stopped. The sudden spike of angry adrenaline from slamming the dashboard had actually helped wake him up further, clearing the last remnants of the brain fog. But as his mind sharpened, a deeply unsettling realization began to creep into his consciousness. He began to analyze the sequence of events. He had slapped the dashboard out of anger, and the sound, a sound allegedly being produced by an inanimate, lifeless object rolling around in the truck bed, had stopped abruptly and instantly in direct response to his outburst. That is not how physics works. An inanimate object doesn't care if you yell. A loose tool doesn't freeze in place because you strike the dashboard. The coincidence was too perfect, too reactive. David sat in the driver's seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind tumbling down a dark rabbit hole of paranoia. He was silently debating whether he needed to swallow his pride and pull over to inspect the bed. And then, the debate was settled. Out of nowhere, a deafening, explosive crack erupted from directly behind his skull. It was a sound so violently loud it defied description. It wasn't a thump. It was the terrifying concussive impact of a heavy, solid object being hurled with maximum force against tempered glass. The next 30 seconds were a blur of pure, unadulterated chaos and screaming terror. David violently twisted his body around, looking through the rear window divider that separated the cab from the truck bed. What he saw nearly caused him to rip the steering wheel completely off its column. Standing upright in the bed of his truck, illuminated by the harsh red glow of the taillights, was a human being. It was a man wearing a dark hoodie. He was gripping a heavy, metal tool that belonged to David, and he was using it to violently, repeatedly bash the glass divider. Crack, crack, crack. The man wasn't just hitting the glass. He was attacking it with a wild, feral, barbaric intensity. He moved with the frantic, unhinged desperation of a rabid animal trying to claw its way out of a cage or trying to claw its way in. Panic seized David's nervous system. He let out an involuntary scream, his foot slamming on the brakes while his hands violently jerked the steering wheel. The heavy truck swerved wildly across the empty highway. The tires shrieked against the asphalt, fighting for traction. David lost total control of the vehicle. The truck began to fist-state, the heavy rear end sliding violently to the side. For a terrifying second, weightlessness took over, and David genuinely believed the truck was going to dig its tires and violently flip, sending them tumbling in a shower of crushed metal and sparks. But his only thought, his only consuming terror, was the absolute maniac standing just inches behind his head, swinging a piece of steel at the fragile glass barrier. Miraculously, David's frantic counter-steering caught. He wrestled the massive vehicle back under control, the brakes locking as the truck skidded to a violent, smoking halt, straddling the line between the right lane and the grassy shoulder. The world stopped spinning. Like the silence of the night rushed back in. David sat hyperventilating, completely disoriented. He should have been paralyzed by the near-death experience of the skid. But an incredibly strange, totally uncharacteristic surge of adrenaline hijacked his brain. He wasn't a brave man. He didn't carry a weapon. But the sheer violation of the moment, the terrifying audacity of the attack, flipped a switch in his mind. He couldn't just sit in a cab and wait to be murdered. He had to confront the psychopath in the bed. David ripped his seatbelt off, threw the driver's side door open, and leapt out into the cool night air. He sprinted around the rear quarter panel, his fists clenched, screaming into the dark. As he rounded the tailgate, he saw the figure. The man in the hoodie was frantically scrambling over the side of the truck bed. His boots hit the pavement with a heavy thud. Without hesitation, the man turned and sprinted wildly toward the pitch-black tree line that bordered the highway. Fueled by blinding adrenaline, David gave chase. He sprinted across the asphalt, crashing into the tall, damp grass of the ditch, hunting the silhouette. But as he reached the edge of the woods, the adrenaline evaporated, replaced instantly by the crushing weight of reality. He stopped dead in his tracks. He was standing on the edge of a pitch-black forest, miles from civilization. He was entirely alone. And he was chasing a complete maniac into the dark. A maniac who might very well be armed with a knife, a gun, or the very tool he had used to smash the glass. The terrifying vulnerability of his situation crashed down on him. The bout of false confidence was gone. David spun around, sprinted back to his idling truck, threw himself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and stomped on the gas pedal. The truck roared back onto the highway, leaving the dark woods far behind. He didn't even glance in his rearview mirror. He just wanted to put miles between himself and the monster. He drove for several miles, his heart hammering against his ribs, before he finally felt safe enough to pull over onto a wide, illuminated shoulder to assess the damage. He killed the engine and stepped out. His legs were shaking so violently, he had to lean against the side of the truck to keep from collapsing. The psychological shock was setting in, manifesting as a severe, suffocating panic attack. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to take deep, measured breaths, calming his racing heart until the world stopped spinning. He walked around to the back of the cabin, shined his phone's flashlight onto the rear window. The thick, tempered glass divider was utterly destroyed. It hadn't shattered into a million pieces, but it was covered in a massive, chaotic splitter bare of deep, white cracks. One more forceful, well-placed strike would have caved the entire window in out, raining glass down on David's head and allowing the attacker to climb directly into the cab while driving at 70 miles an hour. David climbed up onto the rear tire and vaulted himself into the bed of the truck, wanting to see exactly which heavy tool the man had weaponized. As he swept his flashlight across the ribbed metal floor, something caught his attention. Something that absolutely did not belong. It wasn't a hammer. It wasn't a wrench. Resting in the corner of the bed, near the tailgate, was a foreign object. David crept closer, his beam of light trembling. Took his shocked brain a few seconds to process the visual information. It was a small, plastic trash bag. It was roughly the size of two clenched fists. It had been meticulously wrapped and twisted over on itself multiple times, as if whoever prepared it was desperately trying to keep the contents completely secure and hidden from the world. The plastic looked strangely wet, glistening in the beam of the flashlight. David crouched down, leaning his face closer to inspect the bizarre package. The moment he got within a foot of it, the smell hit him. It was an odor so intensely foul, so aggressively rancid, that David instantly gagged, his stomach violently turning over. It smelled like death. It smelled like meat that had been left to rot in the hot sun. A putrid, biological decay that offended every sense in his body. He didn't know what was inside that bag, and his survival instincts screamed at him that he did not want to find out. He just needed the horrific, rotting object out of his truck, immediately. Moving as gingerly as humanly possible, trying to minimize contact, David reached out and pinched the twisted knot of the plastic bag between his thumb and forefinger. He hoisted it up, holding it at arm's length, and violently hurled it over the side of the truck, sending it tumbling into the dark weeds of the ditch. He wiped his brow, relieved to be rid of the nightmare cargo. He hopped down from the tailgate and climbed back into the driver's seat, desperate to finish the final leg of the journey and lock himself inside his house. He put the truck in drive. As he reached up to adjust the steering wheel, the dome light illuminated his hands. David froze. His fingers, his palms, they weren't injured, coated in a thin, wet, sticky substance. The bag hadn't just been wet with condensation. It had been leaking a fluid that had now transferred directly onto David's bare skin. It was red. It was blood. A wave of pure, absolute nausea washed over him. The horrific, rancid smell of the bag was suddenly explained. He was covered in the biological fluid of whatever dark, rotting secret that man had brought into the bed of his truck. There was no water. There were no wipes. He was trapped in a moving metal box with the residue of a nightmare. He frantically scrubbed his hands violently against the rough denim of his jeans, trying to wipe the sickening stain away, gripping the steering wheel tight as he drove the rest of the way home in a state of absolute psychological shock. David never called the police. He kept the terrifying encounter locked entirely inside his own head. It wasn't until weeks later, after the adrenaline had finally burned out of his system, that he even muttered a word of it to his closest friends. He paid a buddy under the table to replace the shattered glass, asking no questions, leaving no paper trail. But the silence didn't erase the memory. When David sits alone at night and replays the impossible geometry of that evening, there is only one logical, terrifying explanation that makes sense. The man didn't jump into the truck on the highway. The man carrying that horrific, bleeding bag had been roaming the dark parking lot of the gas station. When David pulled into the darkest corner, turned off his engine, and fell into a deep sleep, the man had silently climbed over the tailgate and crawled into the open bed. While David slept peacefully in the cab, a madman was lying just inches away on the metal floor. And for the first hour of the drive, as David zoned out and listened to the radio, the man had been lying completely, perfectly flat in the back, silently watching the stars pass by, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. David has survived violent encounters before. He has wrestled with killers. But he swears, looking back at the shattered glass and the bleeding bag, that realizing he had driven a monster down the highway in the dark is, by far, the most terrifying thing he has ever endured. Thank you for listening tonight, friends. Check your back seats. Lock your doors. And if you hear a thump in the dark, keep driving. Good night.